I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm glad that we can speak about your book. But before we get into that, I think it's so important to sort of shine a light on the person that's written the book. And yeah, the first question I think that sort of helps understand who you are, why you've written the book, etc., is what's your fundamental disagreement with the status quo, with what's going on, because if you were okay with everything, you wouldn't have bothered to write the book. So let's start there.
So actually, I don't have a fundamental disagreement with the status quo. So I think there are some books which are written because people are really angry with something. So they think, oh, climate change is overblown. So let me write a book called False Alarm about why climate change is a hoax. But then I think it leads to a very one-sided book. So if a book is reactionary or defensive or aggressive, then you do not see something nuanced. So here, I didn't fundamentally disagree with the status quo, but I do think there is something which I can enlighten the audience around. And so my motivation was not because I disagree with somebody, I want to tell them why they're wrong, but because I have studied how people get misled by flimsy information, and I wanted to highlight to the reader that some information that we will be using to drive high stakes decisions is flimsy, how to spot this, and how to think more critically and think smarter.
So I guess broadly the disagreement is with all the mistakes and sort of missteps that people make when they don't think critically, right? Would that be a fair characterization?
Sure, although I might not say it's a disagreement. I could write a book on how to live more healthy. It's not that I disagree with everybody who eats chocolate cake, or I could write a book about how to better manage my time. Do I fundamentally disagree with people who procrastinate? So here I think my goal is to help make the reader better. Why people might make mistakes is not that they're bad people. So at the heart of the book, I highlight the problem of biases. So biases is that we have a view of the world, and if we see something that conforms to that view of the world, we will accept it uncritically. Again, not because we're bad people who deliberately want to accept misinformation, but we do like to see things that confirm our viewpoint. And indeed, within the book, I go through examples where I myself was misinformed because of my own confirmation bias. So this is something that can happen to all of us.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that. And I think then to perhaps dig a little deeper, what's your origin story? What sort of shaped you? What made you who you are? And for me personally, for example, it was dinner table conversations that were very important. And what shaped me was the challenges I faced, the challenges I overcame. So if you could sort of, run us through that, your origin story and all the things that shaped you and made you who you are, and eventually then, also led to the book.
So I do think there are people who had to overcome very big challenges, and that did make them who they are. But I think, again, this is really overblown. People like to say, oh, I had to overcome massive adversity, had huge amounts of discrimination and so on. And I think often we like to believe those stories because we like to believe in the underdog. People claim that Apple was so successful because Steve Jobs was adopted and therefore he wanted to prove himself. But Steve Jobs himself says, well, this is actually not true, even though Walter Isaacson's biography was about it. So I don't think there were particular trigger events or setbacks. Yeah, I had to deal with difficulty, but everybody has to deal with difficulty growing up. I don't think I was uniquely had things really hard and therefore I'm angry with the world or felt the need to prove myself. So what do I think was important about my origin? And this is something I'm very grateful for, is I had a Montessori education. So what is a Montessori education? This is where you're encouraged to think critically and think for yourself rather than just accepting something. And it also involved more holistic experiential learning. So if we were to learn about Hadrian's Wall, we would then go to Hadrian's Wall and walk along it. If we were going to read the Canterbury Tales, we would then go to Canterbury. And so this has led me to, I think, have taken a more holistic approach to everything I work on. So even though I'm a data-driven guy and being a professor of finance, I look at sustainability issues, which tend to be softer and more qualitative. Things such as corporate culture, inclusion and psychological safety. These are issues which I find to be very interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty cool actually, because the reason I ask these questions is more to get the stories out of people, where I find it lovely how you're applying your own book to that and making sure you don't say something, that's sort of zooming in into something that's not very generalizable. And so, well, I think the last question that sort of I find interesting when sort of shining the light on someone is around, what makes them wake up every morning, right? So sort of mission, meaning, purpose, vision, all these other things, which is also obviously very often overblown and sort of, reverse engineered once someone has succeeded at something. So keeping that in mind, it'd be nice to sort of understand, your motivation for writing the book and for what you do, and sort of, what drives you.
So what woke me up this morning was my alarm clock. And you might think, oh, is that a very flippant way to give the answer? But I think it's realistic. So again, you hear a lot of claims that I am woken up and driven by the desire to change the world, or to come up with some amazing invention, or to do my research, which is really fundamental. And I think that may well be true for some people. But I think if we're always waiting for this purpose, then people might think, oh, I'm not going to be motivated unless I find the dream job, or at work I need to be staffed on the best deal. Things will not be perfect, and I think the challenge is to keep going and to have perseverance, even if you would rather stay in bed and you'd rather switch off the alarm. And so one thing I'm really into is fitness. Even if you're exhausted, even if you've flown on a plane, I will still try to do a workout every single day, not because I feel motivated or purposeful, but because I think it's just good for me. And certainly for me, I woke up because my alarm went off. Now, during the day, there will be certain things that I enjoy, and genuinely I enjoy this conversation. I enjoy the fact that somebody's taken the time to read the book that I spent years writing, and also wants to share it on his platform with his listeners. But there will be other things that I'm not excited by, but I will still do to the best of my ability due to professional pride. And I think what matters is consistency just as much as intensity. Yes, so I understand that purpose is useful, and I've written a book about purpose, but if we always wait for purpose to fire for us to do something, then it will be that we're inconsistent and unreliable. I think the key strength is even when things are not so rosy and you might feel a bit tired, to keep going and do your job out of professional pride, respect for your audience, respect for your colleagues.
So I guess then we'll have to ask you is sort of, what kind of routines or habits do you then use? Because so the case you're making for is really, it's all about just showing up and doing the stuff. And I think that's very true. And I realized that when writing my own book, how hard that was. So yeah, what are some sort of practical techniques that you use that could be useful for others?
So let me give you an inspirational quote. Not by an amazing philosopher or famous person. I'm going to give you a quote from a rapper. This is from a boy band called East 17, which was in the UK in the 1990s, around the same time as sort of, I think, New Kids on the Block and Take That. So you might think it's really embarrassing for me to give this quote. But over Easter, I was just rewatching in 90s nostalgia a video of this band perform, and at the end, the rapper Tony Mortimer said, "You don't know how many times you're going to play here in your life. So if you do get the chance, you've got to rock it big time." And so why I love that quote is that highlights things that we might see as being mundane, to take them seriously because it's an honor to do that. For example, this morning I had my first meeting on the advisory board for a large infrastructure fund. That fund has got offices in Australia, therefore it was 7 a.m. Therefore, I set my alarm at 6 a.m. Why? I had already read all the pre-readings previously, but I wanted to refresh myself to make sure that I'm at the top of my game. Why? I think it's a pleasure to be invited to be on this advisory board, to guide this large fund on some important decisions, and to take that really seriously. And this also will be the case for podcasts. So it will be that I will prepare myself for this, not thinking, oh, I've done 50 podcasts, so I don't need to prepare. Each time I teach, even if I've given that lecture many times before, I will want to prepare my notes again, refresh the material, to take it really seriously, because I think it is a privilege to do so. So how does that square with my prior idea that, oh, we shouldn't view things as massively purposeful or passionate? Well, what I view is that even everyday things can be something which drives you. It doesn't always have to be the biggest possible stage for you to think this is going to get me out of bed. Now, every morning
Sure.
I do my workout, but I couldn't go this morning because of this advisory board meeting, so I went at 12:15 p.m., which was when the next available class was. I was feeling pretty tired, I have to admit, because I've been up since 6 a.m. I've been on a 2.5-hour advisory board meeting, but I still went along, and I feel much better and more alert because of going to that fitness class, and that's why we're now in the mid-afternoon UK time, and I'm still quite energetic and alert because of the fitness class rather than despite it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, and I think this is such a nice, realistic way to just go about things, and so much more practical. But then now I kind of also understand how Malcolm Gladwell's popularized 10,000 hour thing would have tripped you the way described in the book. It tripped me big time, because when I was 15, I think one of my teachers told me about this and sort of really pushed all of us to go all in on whatever we were interested in getting good at. And then many years later I read Range by David Epstein, and he sort of debunks a lot of that and sort of provides the other perspective. And then I watched the debate between Malcolm Gladwell and the author of Range, David Epstein, and so it's really nice that you kind of break that down in the book, that you apply your that you kind of provide this ladder of misinference framework. And it'd be nice if you could just share how one of these super popular sort of myths ended up creating trouble for you, or sort of driving you astray, that you haven't yet really spoken about in public.
Certainly. So what is the 10,000 hours rule? So this is the idea that you can become successful in anything if you were just to practice for 10,000 hours. And this exploits our confirmation bias. We want this to be true. We teach our kids that practice makes perfect. We would love to believe that the world is our oyster. As long as we work hard enough and we want it enough, we will be successful. And also, we see people who are successful, and we would like to believe that they had to sweat to get there. We don't like to believe that they were just born lucky. That just doesn't fit with our worldview. But what is the actual evidence for this? Well, he basically bases the entire rule around one specific study, and this was a study of German violinists. So what he did is he got some violinists, and those violinists had been classified by their teachers as being great, excellent, or average. Great, good, or average. And then he asked those violinists, how long have you played? How much did you practice from age 5? Now, that was 18 years ago. So they were now 23 years old, and you can't remember how much you practiced probably last week, let alone 18 years ago. So it could well be reverse causality. If you know that you're a great violinist today, then you will probably say, yeah, I did practice a lot in the past. And if you know that you're mediocre today, you probably will not admit to practicing a lot, because then you'd have to admit to yourself that all of those hours were not worth it. So if anything, it is actual success today drives your reported practice rather than practice driving success. And another issue is that what mattered was not just the total number of hours of practice, but something specific which is called deliberate practice. So this is not just rehearsing or going through the motions, but difficult practice working on your scales guided by a coach. And that is very different from the message of Gladwell, which just says just put the hours in. So within the same chapter, where he talks about the 10,000 hours rule, he gives the example of the Beatles, who did long jam sessions and long performances, yet the study which investigated violinists explicitly only focused on solo practice and separated out performing into another category. So the idea that all that matters is the quantity of practice, not the quality, that is again appealing. All we need to do is rack up the hours. It doesn't really matter what we're doing in those hours.
But is there a myth that sort of, sort of based or linked with these two biases that really affected you in your life that you haven't really shared so far?
Well, not particularly. So I have shared when I was duped by the 10,000 hours rule in the book. That is public; it's written in the book, and I fell for the 10,000 hours rule. And not only did I fall for it, I started to teach it to my students. And only when I looked at the evidence more carefully did I realise that the evidence was flimsy, which highlights that all of us can fall for these biases. It's not that this is suffered. Sometimes readers or listeners might think I'm so smart, I won't suffer from this, but everybody can fall for these biases.
Yeah, no, very true. And I think the other point I want to dig deeper in was around groupthink, because it's something you address, right? When individuals have biases and groups of individuals are making decisions, then groupthink is a problem. And what I've observed very often in practice with groupthink is that people, when they agree on something and they see other people agreeing, etc., that leads to a sort of commoditization of what they do and ideas and the products, etc. And it'd be nice to sort of hear your thoughts on that. Sitting on boards and very practically, how do you what kind of methods and habits, practices do you suggest using to sort of fight groupthink?
I think this is to actively seek different viewpoints and to make it easy and actually to encourage differences of opinion, because it's through differences of opinion that you will actually get better decisions. And so let me give an example of where this fails. So I am honoured to be a fellow of the British Academy. I'm really grateful to be elected. So this is the distinguished body for humanities and social sciences. And then every year what happens is there's nominations for the new fellows, and then you have to vote as to whether you think these people have met the distinction required to be a fellow. And this was my first year voting, and for some of them I said, yes, they do meet, and for others I said they do not meet. And I was told, you're not allowed to vote that. I was told to falsify my vote. I was told that you need to instead say undecided. But I said, no, I'm not undecided. Here, I think that the bar for a fellow should be very high. This person does okay work, but they don't cross the bar. But I said, no, you have to vote undecided. And I said, no, I'm going to vote no. And they said, no, okay, if you do that, the only way that you're able to do that is if your vote becomes public. You need to accompany your vote with a 500-word memo that you need to sign, and that gets shared with all of the rest of your section, which for me is management and business studies. This is hugely problematic because this means it's very difficult for you to dissent. Why? Because then you are hauled up, and then people will just start attacking your rationale for for having a different viewpoint. You're publicly known to be the dissenter. Whereas in contrast, if you were just to rub a stamp and say, oh, this person meets it, why don't you have to explain your view? Because if indeed being a fellow is a massive distinction, you should have to put your name to it and say why you think this person is amazing. And indeed, this is, you see people who've had distinction. Let's say Elizabeth Holmes was made a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. That was something where whoever put their name to that without actually scrutinizing what she was doing, they should be held accountable. Yet, many organizations only have it that you have to stick your neck above the parapet if you are to disagree. And I think this is hugely problematic. And for an institution, an academic institution like the British Academy, which should understand the importance of different viewpoints, to say, well, actually, number one, you have to falsify your vote. And number two, the only way that you can oppose is by not being anonymous, unlike everybody else, and then you have to write a 500-word argument. That's something which I think is not encouraging different perspectives.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic example. I wasn't aware of this, and I'm glad you shared this. So for the next couple of questions, I thought I'd just sort of try to disagree or challenge some things in the spirit of what you just said.
Sure.
And I've read a lot of behavioral economics books and cognitive psychology as a teenager growing up. And it was almost like I had a zoo of biases that I was trying to track and sort of keep in mind and understand when and how they show up. What I found very enlightening in your book was that you use essentially confirmation bias and black and white thinking, and sort of have a entire book of material just based on these two biases. So are there, aren't there so many more biases and shortcomings in human thinking? How come, you only chose these two? I mean, you did a great job of mapping so much to these two, but what was the thinking behind this, and how did you come to this conclusion?
That's absolutely a fair challenge, Ritavan. And if you go to Wikipedia's list of cognitive biases, there's hundreds of cognitive biases. So just to give you an example of another one, there's one bias known as the rhyme as reason effect, where people think that rhyming phrases are more credible than non-rhyming phrases. For example, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. That was very powerful. It got a O.J. Simpson freed. But that is, I don't think, a major bias. It works in particular cases, but it's not all the time that we are convinced by rhyming phrases. So I thought confirmation and bias and black and white thinking are very pervasive because we see this very commonly. So what is confirmation bias? If we have a viewpoint, then we will accept something that supports it and reject something that opposes it. But we often don't have a viewpoint about things. And that's where black and white thinking comes into play. Even if we're truly agnostic, we don't have a pre-existing view. What black and white thinking means is that we're more likely to be swayed by something extreme than something moderate. And so I think the two of them in combination, confirmation bias where we do have a pre-existing viewpoint, and black and white thinking where we don't, they together are responsible for a large part of the misinformation that we see out there.
Yeah, and before reading the book, I wasn't convinced, but after reading the book, I think you make a pretty exhaustive point of how so much is covered by these two. So that was really a big learning for me, and thanks for doing that in the book. But that brings me to the other thing. I think along with reading a lot of books and literature around, and sort of based on papers and research around behavioral biases and cognitive and, human thinking and cognitive psychology. What I also sort of enjoyed reading was game theory, and especially applied game theory sort of to real life settings. And that was all about incentives, about objectives, and add to that, mindset and temperament and emotional state when making a decision. And how does all that factor in, along with sort of your framework around detecting what is true, what's not, right, and where lies might lie? How do you factor in the fact that people might be incentivized to lie or to believe a lie, or they might be in an emotional state of fear or excitement or whatever? So just your general thoughts on that, and how people should go about thinking about this.
I think it's to recognize the importance of emotional state and temperament and bias. So often academics might think, well, the best way to convince somebody is to show them better data. And if I show them just really high quality data, they'll be just convinced because of the data. This is true, perhaps if they were robots, but they're not. They're humans. And so I think whenever you're trying to convince somebody, make it in the language that they are willing to accept. So give an example, let's say climate change. So why is it that there are so many people who believe that climate change is a hoax or exaggerated, despite hugely informative documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth? An Inconvenient Truth was all about Al Gore. So this suggested this is something that Republicans should not believe in. It's only for Democrats. And so I think that documentary may well have backfired. And so then when I think about showing data, I'd like to put this in cultural meanings that are likely to appeal to Republicans. So if I was to say climate change is real, therefore we need to heavily regulate companies and tax emissions, some of them will just don't like that. But if you were to say climate change is real, Therefore, we need human ingenuity, we need commercial innovation to come up with green hydrogen and green steel, carbon capture, utilization and storage, ways to launch solar reflectors into the atmosphere. Those are things which may well resonate with Republicans. So I think it's to understand it's not just the data in isolation, but the cultural meanings associated with it. Now, if there are people who have a very strong emotional state, let's say that their salary or their job depends on something wrong being true, then I think maybe you can't convince them. And I think it's important just to pick your battles. So I remember someone posting on social media, I think they were just angry about something, they said, before you argue with somebody, ask yourself, do they have the intellectual maturity to understand the concept of a different viewpoint? And if indeed it's very unlikely that the person will ever accept something different, then just save your effort. You're not going to convince everybody. Don't boil the ocean. Pick your battles. It may well be if somebody is working for a particular lobby group, say, I don't know, about tobacco being fine, you're probably not going to convince them, even with the newest evidence that smoking causes harm, so probably don't bother.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think what comes to mind is also what happens is people are shaped by their local environment or their lived experience, and so I think not everyone's operating somewhere near the median, right? Like the distribution of experiences is pretty varied and sometimes, very skewed in one or the other direction. And so when someone's experiencing, for example, I don't know, they see a lot of homeless people who've immigrated to their town right outside. It's something Ezra Klein brought up in his book. And then you go and tell them, no, but look, immigration is not a problem, or you show them a whole bunch of statistics. They say, hey, but I just have to look out of the window and I see the problem, right? And so you have this for a whole bunch of lived experiences where when something is generalizable, it's by definition supposed to apply in all cases. And yet people have, different experiences. I think the same also with different therapies, that are, let's say based on natural ingredients or whatever. And so I think the fact of picking your battles is very important, because if someone's had a certain experience, it's, I think, very hard to convince them otherwise. The important thing perhaps might just be to point out that their personal experience does not necessarily generalize either.
Yeah.
Then this is one thing I wanted to, like, after having read the book, sort of discuss with you, which was around framing the problems correctly. And I think what you just said, for example, around, you don't want to boil the ocean, you don't want to frame the, if you're trying to convince everyone of everything that's true, that's a failed cause. So what are your thoughts around framing problems correctly to avoid sort of wasted effort? Because there's always a certain objective you're trying to reach. And what happens very often is, people are looking for a solution where it's easiest to find the solution. This is sort of, this image, with someone looking for their home keys or car keys under the traffic light, sort of under the street, the street lamp, because that's where the light is brightest and it's easier to look for the keys there. And that's one thing that happens commonly, is look where it's easy to find something. And the other thing is that you're only seeing a slice of reality, the sort of story of the, 5-6 poor blind men, that where each of them is sort of just touching one part of an elephant, and they sort of generalize their personal experience. So around of taking a step back, understanding the system, posing the problem correctly. What are your experiences and thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think you should always want to be an outlier. So an outlier is finding solutions which are complex. So it's not looking where everybody else is looking. So one of the fields I work in is asset management. And in asset management, you don't want to be using the same data that everybody else is looking at. So people want to measure diversity by looking at demographic diversity, but everybody's got access to those statistics. So I'm highlighting the importance of other forms, such as cognitive diversity. So I would always want to be contrarian, because I would like outlier ideas, because it's the outlier ideas which are the ones which are going to be having greatest impact.
Yeah, and I think the extent to which you go into the example, with Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis was very enlightening. Like I hadn't read or seen that in such detail anywhere else. Yeah, so I, which sort of brings me to the other point around, around social proof and hierarchy and seniority, because what happened the first time around, right? In when the Bay of Pigs example was when Kennedy, being as you described in the book, being a young president, sort of trusted the senior leadership of the military to sort of make the call, and how should people sort of just think about not necessarily taking social proof at face value, sort of believing in themselves, in the rigor of their thinking, and the uniqueness of their, and the outlier uniqueness of their perspective when making decisions and when voicing those concerns too, because I think you don't always have to have a Bay of Pigs necessarily to to do it differently next time. So I think what sort of thought experiment should they run, do their Bay of Pigs in their mind, so that they can avoid that in reality.
I think it's to often just to think, what if you're wrong? And to realize that you may well be wrong in many cases. So even if you're an extremely successful investor, it may well be that 40% of your stock picks are wrong. Yes, if you are to be right 60% of the time, you could well be in the top league. But why do you want to be right 60% of the time? Why not try and be 65 or 70%? So even if you are an extremely successful investor, it will not be at all that every single investment that you do is correct. And even if you do a correct investment, it might be that you're exiting at the wrong time. So you can always improve, and just to have the mindset that I can always do better, that will then lead you to wanting to get other opinions and additional perspectives in order to be continuously improving.
Yeah, thanks. Now, in the context of misinformation and lies, and what I like about the book is that you say, lies need not be sort of the purest, meanest, nastiest type of thing. Lies is just what is complementary to the truth, and so anything that's that's a shade of gray also is a lie by that definition. And in the current context we're operating in, there's a book I keep recommending called AI Snake Oil by Arvind Narayanan Sayash. Forget his last name now. And it'd be nice to hear when you look at the contemporary dialogue and what's posted on LinkedIn or other social platforms, as well as in the news. How would you recommend readers, listeners think about applying more rigor to understanding when something is being hyped by a certain vested interest, or when someone's essentially being excited emotionally to buy something? So your thoughts on sort of this very contemporary problem or context we're in?
I think if it's being hyped, then that's already the signal. So when something is extreme and being promoted as being amazing, nearly everything in life has costs and benefits. So just to say, oh, AI is so amazing, it's going to completely replace jobs, it probably is not. Yes, AI is a useful tool. It might replace some jobs, but it won't replace others. Similarly, if something is marketed as a superfood or as an amazing technique to change how you are as a leader, it's probably going to be massively overhyped in the lie. For example, Simon Sinek says every single successful leader in the world thinks in exactly the same way, and it's exactly the opposite way to everybody else. That is ridiculous, right? There's lots of different successful leaders who have different ways of thinking. Some of them might be more introverted, some might be extroverted, some might be visionary, others might be execution oriented. To the idea that there is one single best way that's going to lead to success, if it was so easy, everybody would adopt that single way and then they would all be successful.
So it's almost as if being extreme is a shortcut to grab attention, is a shortcut to then get famous yourself, right? And would you then make the case that if you're more nuanced, yes, it might be a longer ride, but over time it's more valuable, it's it's more useful to people, and it's also something that sort of builds trust over time?
Yes, and you might think, okay, is that realistic? Because don't we need to be extreme in order to get people's attention? And sadly, it is the case in social media, but in other cases, we do know if something is too good to be true. So if a price was extremely low, then we would think, well, there's something wrong about it. If a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. And we just need to apply that same discernment to social media. For example, with podcasts, I had this recently. So one I got another invitation from a podcast, and I asked, well, how many people will attend this? And she said that you'll get thousands of live views. So it was a live webinar, and then thousands of views afterwards. And then I thought, well, that's a lot, because I've done some talks with some very good platforms, and even if the live views might only be several hundred. And then I went to YouTube and I saw her past episodes had about 40 views to them. So had she not said thousands and thousands, I might not have checked. But because it seems so implausible, I then checked and I realised that this was a massive exaggeration. So more discerning audiences will hopefully rein in such extreme claims.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I'm currently, my podcast's not even launched, right? So I'm currently recording episodes, and so when I reached out, I just, told you explicitly about what I'm trying to do with the podcast, and that, it's not even launched, and so it's really nice that that you're here. Perhaps just some final thoughts. I think as we wrap up.
Yeah. Sorry, and I would that honest approach is much better than claiming you're going to get thousands and thousands of views, which doesn't sit well with somebody who wrote a book on misinformation and exaggeration.
Yeah, and I'm glad it worked out, and I hope it does get thousands of views over time, and I think it will sort of compound. But I think what you say around, you can either take the quick, short route and burn bridges and burn trust and confidence, or just play the longer game. And I think that honesty probably compounds. Some final thoughts. What would be a couple of points that you would want to leave listeners with before we wrap up?
So there is lots of misinformation out there from lots of sources, and this might include very trusted sources. So just a couple of days ago, Francesca Gino, this star professor at Harvard, had her tenure revoked for allegedly falsifying data. So you might think, well, if I can't even trust Harvard Business School, who can I trust? But what I want to highlight is actually addressing misinformation is much, much easier than you think. You do not need to get a PhD in statistics or to scrutinize every footnote or check every statistic. You just don't have time for that. But what I'm trying to do in my book is to highlight how practical and simple it is for the everyday person to combat misinformation. And this is to use the tools of discernment that you already have. So just like right now, you are able to notice if a deal is too good to be true or the claim is over-exaggerated in normal cases, we should also apply the same discernment to studies. And we also know how to pick apart a study. If there was a study shared on LinkedIn that you don't like the sound of, you might say, oh, this is correlation but not causation, or is this a cherry-picked example? Now we know how to pick apart studies that we do like, so let's just apply the same discernment to studies that we don't like. All I'm encouraging you to do is use the critical thinking faculties that you already have, rather than saying everybody needs to do a PhD in statistics. So I think this is important to know how to deal with this misinformation, but it's also realistic and practical and actionable, and that's what I wanted to achieve in my book.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. May Contain Lies is the book. Grab a copy and read it. It's one of the best sort of books on critical thinking of the past years. So thank you for doing this, Alex. It was a lovely conversation.
Thanks very much, Ritterban.